Contract tests and tests as a documentation. What our listeners find from that? Let's look back on the comments to our videos. And we're starting today with the comment from
Joost Baas, right?
Yes, who gave us a very good and long comment about his experience with contract tests. I would like to start with experience that we have in many organizations that APIs are often producer driven. What do you think about this, Bart?
I'm kind of on the fence about this because the value of a producer designed API creates a coherent design. If you only implement exactly what a particular consumer needs, you will get a call for that consumer, and you'll get another call for another consumer, and you will get another call for another consumer, and that makes it harder to expose the information that you own in a way that future use cases could hook into it. So I guess it makes sense for early stage microservices or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, but aren't we here mixing different types of the APIs? Generic APIs that you're saying, okay, this is the product, use it. And there are APIs that you're building ad hoc or more tailored for specific use case. So this is an API which I'm using to connect to this domain, for example. This is the line that we're using. Again, I don't think that any of those approaches are necessarily the only approach and the best approach. They are context dependent. The product APIs, I think that is what mostly people are starting to build. Just expose everything and then we don't have to return to it. People will just use it, consume it as it is. But the product APIs are more expensive to build and more expensive to maintain and very expensive to evolve. So what I think that here part of the problem that Joost mentioned, and also we are now talking, is that maybe sometimes we're too early to build fixed product APIs, where in the early stages it would be much better to work with the dedicated. And sometimes you can long for quite a long when I really prefer to build tailored and specific APIs. And only when there are a couple of consumers and a common topic start to arise, then it's a good moment to build the product API. Otherwise, you're getting either with over-engineered something or often under-engineering something that just expose what we have in database as it is without any thought about what are the consequences of this exposure, and then the following generations will fight with the small details that you exposed, like IDs that were saved somewhere, and then you need to somehow get rid of that entity that you don't even want to be existed in the first place.
Exactly. If you start by basically tightly coupling yourself to logic on all your consumer side, which is a result of starting with a product API before knowing what kind of product people actually need, then you're gonna have a hard time evolving your product to better match what people need.
And in a sense, early producer-driven APIs is a sign of lack of agility or misunderstanding the philosophy of agility. So you're building to expose something instead of saying, okay, what my consumers need now? What are the other consumers need now?
So are you saying that if an organization has mostly producer-driven APIs, that that is an organization with too much legacy code, or is that an organization that treats too much code like it's legacy code?
That all depends on the context and the evolution time. But if in the early stages of organization growth, you have many producer-driven APIs, then it's a good sign that the APIs are built not based on the feedback from consumers. There is a sign that most probably the feedback loops are cut off or lost. Somewhere, maybe either in the planning stage or maybe all the way to the implementation stage, but somewhere probably something is cut off. And you, again, even when we're talking about later, more mature phases, and we're saying, okay, we have products, we have a vision for products, we have the APIs, they should also still be to some extent driven by either consumer needs or some strong vision about how we want to form the needs of our consumers. Not again just by simply saying, okay, yeah, this is what we have.
Yeah, it really seems to me like for a mature agile product, there's a need for both types of APIs. So you're gonna need to have a coherent, exposed product that makes sense for your domain, but you're also gonna need a like pilot type API where you're gonna be experimenting with new connections with required by new consumers that may or may not end up in this coherent API in a later version. And then this pilot API can have like a rapid innovation cycle, and the product API can have a slower innovation cycle that makes it easier for consumers to migrate to the new reality of this new product API that internalizes some of the use cases from the pilot API.
Yeah, and depending on how we define the area of a product or domain that we're talking, sometimes you don't even need to have the full product API, because maybe you have one or two consumers, your main consumers, and just the specific ones would be more than enough.
Exactly, yeah.
And you do want probably to go for more elaborate product APIs when you do have multiple consumers, indefinite number. Okay, especially if you have indefinite numbers of consumers. But
when does that change? Like, say you have 3 different connections with 3 different calls, and those 3 could maybe be encapsulated in some form of RESTful entity-based API instead of the 3 now maybe specific endpoints that you offer for 3 different consuming teams. Is that a point that you would say it makes sense to turn this into a product API?
Okay, I am not sure that it would be easy to say exact the number and exact heuristics how you will know that it's time or not time. But probably when it's become not really valuable to discuss the needs of the consumer because they squarely fit into the existing APIs that you build for other consumers, when it makes sense to start building a product API. I would not have a problem maintaining 4 or 5 dedicated APIs with slightly different slices as long as they are distinct. I see and I maintain the communication. I would also even prefer to maybe stay a little bit longer on the specific APIs, because then I have a more personalized connection with the consumers. Instead of saying this is a generic, this is personalized, and we know this. This can be a little bit of a substitute maybe to the contract test, or also getting know your consumers better. But that's again also comes a little bit to the vision how we see our domain or service or a product. Is it something, a piece of a particular chain, or is it something that we see as belongs to the bigger population of consumers?
There's also maybe like a relation between how much specific endpoints you have versus coherent endpoints you have, that is somehow related to how splintered or how fine-grained your microservice landscape is. I think if you have, say, a broad domain and you have like, I don't know, 30 total services, then maybe it makes more sense to have a coherent API sooner. Well, if your microservices are relatively smaller in relation to the entire size of the infrastructure, then it probably makes more sense to have more dedicated APIs.
Yeah, I think that's a slightly different axis dimension. Mm-hmm. That's the question how much your consumer should know about the details of your implementation. Because indeed, if you have a domain with multiple services or microservices implementing some pieces, especially different teams, but even within one team, and then some other consumers, they need to know, okay, for this type of information I go here, for this time I here, and so on. You're kind of exposing a little bit too much of the details probably of how it works. It can work sometimes tactically, but usually you will probably want to have some kind of facade somewhere. And again, that can still be a specific facade. That can be a facade for a particular client. It still doesn't necessarily mean that it's a product API yet. That's why I'm saying that it's still a different dimension, but that's a very valid point. You, by pointing to a specific small pieces of your domain, you're exposing your implementation. You're making migration changes there more difficult, because if you say, okay, now we're migrating from here to here with this responsibility, then suddenly your clients need to know about it, the consumers. You do want to avoid this.
Yeah, and such a facade can help you with that problem, but that facade itself would also need that separation between a experimental or closer to consumer API and a more coherent domain-based API.
Yeah, that can be. There can be multiple facades. You can bypass facade in the quick experimentation at the beginning, but at the end you will probably not want to have two specific lines. Talking to two specific implementation bits.
Yeah. So are we now like in a roundabout way talking about the way that we have been designing product APIs in last year at Bol.com? We have like 1,000 microservices, and now we have 40 products that each are getting their own facade, which is a product API.
Yes, but here we have a little bit more top-down approach at Bol.com, I think now, which might be still useful, and I can imagine in some areas it might be a good coordinated effort. But I also know that in some domains, people don't really, or at least people I was talking to when I was involved in that, they really didn't see that much of need yet. So it's still a little bit on the in different areas you might have different approaches. So for example, if you have an order service or something that talks to orders, there are many different things that really want to know about that, obviously in the e-commerce domain, but customer order. But on the other hand, purchase order from the supplier for the magazine, it's the lines there are much more specific and dedicated. Where I was involved, we didn't see that much need, and actually we had more harm from generic APIs, because we were starting with a very generic APIs, and we would be splitting it up and would find it much more convenient and easier to maintain and work with dedicated lines, instead of trying to fit everything into one flows into one model, which was not perfectly satisfying anyone and was difficult to evolve. Another point I found interesting in this comment, Jost talks about his experience with previous company before Bol.com, where they did have contract-based testing, but it was a little bit complicated. And one of the reasons was that they were using messaging, and sometimes they even had a problem to find who is consumer and who is producer. That's an interesting thing. I would really like to know more details about that, but we can still speculate maybe a little bit. First of all, about the messaging, because technically when we talk about contract-based testing, nothing prevents us from applying it to the asynchronous, not REST HTTP systems, right?
Like the concept is protocol agnostic.
Yeah, the concept is protocol agnostic, and also the implementations. I know, well, I haven't played myself much, but listening to conferences and talks, I know that there is, especially in the Spring world, in the Spring contracts, they always mention that it's also about the asynchronous messaging, which of course makes sense. So I don't know whether there are practical really problems with messaging, but the fact that Jos says that sometimes they had difficulty distinguishing between consumer and producer, that's a very interesting question.
Yeah, I think this kind of situation would mostly arise where you have bilateral communications going on. So you have a message that is sourced from system A, and that goes to a topic, and system B subscribes to that. But then they change some state and they publish a different message, and then system A subscribes to that message again, and then you can have like interactive state dependencies.
But would it be the same topics or would it be different topics? Because if the topics are different, then this is the same as with the rest, where you have two producer and consumers with the callbacks, right? You can still say, okay, technically split out, this is producer, this is consumer. What I was a little bit afraid maybe is that they were using And that's what I had a little bit of the difficulty is when the message bus or some topic in the messaging system is used by different producers to put the data, because there is like this generic message which is defined, and then there might be some pieces coming from different areas, or in the worst cases where you get different steps of the workflow published with different status by different producers and consumers.
All on the same topic.
Yes, on the same topic. Like order, when we have just a new order, someone publishes, hey, there is a new order. Someone reads this, okay, does something, but oh, it is already paid. This is the details, and so on and so forth. Not about the customer orders, but about some other things. I saw that in my previous experiences also at Bol.com a little bit, but not much, luckily.
But why would you put that on the same topic?
Because it's a generic thing, because it's an idea. Okay, I would not put, okay? I wouldn't put, what I was doing was splitting it up. But because the idea is that then, well, it's again the question of making it generic, because you can say, okay, you know what? There will be some consumers that they don't want to care about where these topics, they don't want to know, they will be just listening to this one generic topic. And they will be listening to the updates. Basically, maybe they will be filtering, say, I don't care about the orders that haven't yet reached a certain state. So it's also a way to build this product like facade API again with the messaging. And it might even in some cases make sense on certain level. Okay.
Right.
Very carefully. But usually not at the beginning.
No, yeah. So, basically, what you're describing is kind of like a similar mismatch of publishing everything as events versus publishing custom events.
Yeah, that's I think. But again, this is my speculation, which could have led. That's where I saw something like that. Yes, that was happening. Almost every producer will be also a consumer, because they would need first to consume the previous workflow state to produce something else, and so on. That I did see. The conclusion is that it's a very interesting comment, and that at least for me it provoked a lot of thinking.